Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. It was a cold, misty London evening. The fog was so thick that Tower Bridge on the other side of the Thames was barely visible. This was my first trip to London, and the one thing I'd been waiting for was the evening tour of the Tower of London. I had always been fascinated by its dark history, tales of kings, queens, and prisoners who met their end within its stone walls. The tour started just as the sun was setting, staining the fog a dull orange. Our guide, an older man with a deep, echoing voice, told us stories about Anne Boleyn's beheading, Lady Jane Grey's tragic execution, and the two young princes who had vanished mysteriously centuries ago. There were about 10 people in the group, but I stayed at the back, snapping photos and recording videos. Strangely, every time the guide mentioned a death, my camera glitched. The screen would fill with static for a second, then clear again. At first, I thought it was my phone, but it only happened when he spoke about a beheading. When we entered the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula, where many royals are buried, the group fell silent, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw her, a woman in white standing near the far corner of the chapel. Her posture was strange. Her head was missing. I froze. When I blinked, she was gone. Curiosity got the better of me. When the group moved on, I stayed behind, pretending to take more photos. The heavy wooden door creaked shut on its own. Suddenly, the chapel felt darker. The air grew colder, so cold I could see my breath. And then I heard it. A whisper at first, like distant prayers, but slowly it became clear. Leave, or join us. I ran to the door and tried to pull it open, but it wouldn't budge. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across the stone floor as if reaching for me. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing from the hallway. A man appeared, dressed in an old guard's uniform, holding a lantern. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his hollow eyes sent a shiver down my spine. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice rough like gravel. I stammered, I was just on the tour, the group." He raised a hand, silencing me. "They come for those who stay too long." Behind him, figures began to emerge from the shadows. A headless woman in white, 2 small boys holding hands, and a hooded executioner carrying a massive axe. They slowly began to circle me. Suddenly, the chapel filled with sound, clashing swords, the cries of the condemned, and the distant toll of bells. I spun around, desperate to open the door, but it was useless. The guard stepped closer, raising the lantern until it lit only his pale face. "You can leave," he whispered, "but you must take one of us with you." Before I could respond, the lantern went out. Darkness swallowed me. The next thing I knew, I was lying outside on the cobblestones, the tower looming silently above me. The night was quiet. My tour group was gone. My phone buzzed. A new photo had been saved to my gallery. When I opened it, my blood turned cold. It was a selfie, one I never took, inside the dark chapel, and behind me stood all of them, the headless queen, the princes, the executioner, and the guard, all smiling. The next morning, I read in the paper that the chapel had been locked all night. No evening tours had taken place. I checked my phone again. The photo had changed. Now all the figures were gone except one. The guard was still there, standing closer than before, and when I looked into the reflection on my phone screen, I saw him standing right behind me. Story note 2. I was traveling through a small village in northern England for a photography project. It was late when I arrived, and every inn was full. Finally, I found an old stone house at the edge of the village with a hand-painted sign that read, "Rooms for rent." An elderly woman opened the door. She stared at me for a long time before saying, "Only one room left." I didn't care what it looked like. I just wanted to sleep. She handed me a rusty key and pointed me to a narrow staircase. "Third floor, last door on the left," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The room was small, but cozy. A bed, a dresser, and a single wooden chair. But something bothered me immediately. There was no window. The air felt stale, heavy. like no one had opened the door in years. I lay down, exhausted, and eventually drifted to sleep. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to the sound of the chair creaking. My heart skipped a beat. The chair was rocking gently on its own. I sat up, convinced I was dreaming. Then I heard breathing, slow, heavy breathing, right next to my ear. I spun around. No one was there. I tried to open the door, but the knob wouldn't turn. It was as if it had been locked from the outside. My phone had no signal. Then came the whisper, "Why are you in my room?" It was a child's voice. The temperature dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath. The chair stopped rocking. Slowly, the dresser drawer slid open by itself. I backed against the wall as a small, pale hand reached out from inside the dresser. A boy, no older than 8, crawled out, his eyes hollow, his mouth twisted into a smile far too wide. "This is my room," he said softly. "You took my bed." I screamed and tried the door again, still locked. He stood in the center of the room, tilting his head like a curious animal. Then slowly he began to crawl toward me, his limbs jerking unnaturally, bones cracking with each movement. When he reached the foot of the bed, he stopped and whispered, "Don't worry. You'll never leave. Not after tonight." The lamp flickered and went out. When it came back on, he was gone. But the bed sheets beside me were warm, like someone had just been lying there. At sunrise, the door was unlocked. I grabbed my things and ran downstairs. The old woman was waiting at the counter. "You stayed in that room?" she asked, shocked. "No one stayed there since the boy died." She handed me back my money, insisting I leave. When I got outside, I finally looked at the photos on my camera. Every picture I had taken in the room was fine, except the last one. In that photo, I was asleep in the bed, and the boy was lying right next to me, smiling at the camera. Story No. 3. I'd always been fascinated by places with dark histories, so when my university announced a student research trip to study medieval prisons, I signed up immediately. The highlight of the trip was a private after-hours tour of the Tower of London, a part of the fortress closed to the public, the Traitor's cells. The guide, a stern-looking man, handed us small electric lanterns. "Stay together," he warned. "These corridors are easy to get lost in." The air inside was damp and heavy, carrying the smell of wet stone and iron. We passed cells where famous prisoners had scratched their names into the wall centuries ago. The other students whispered excitedly, but I stayed near the back taking notes. Then I noticed something odd, a narrow passageway to the right, almost hidden behind a collapsed wooden beam. I raised my lantern and saw rusty bars at the end of it. A cell. "Hey," I called to the guide. "What's down here?" He frowned. "That's not part of the tour. Stay with the group." But curiosity got the better of me. When everyone moved on, I slipped into the passage. The stone walls were so tight I had to turn sideways to squeeze through. The cell was small, barely enough space to stand. Deep gouges marked the walls, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. A single rusty shackle still hung from the floor. Then I heard it. A faint, ragged breathing. I turned, but no one was there. The passage behind me seemed longer than before, the light from the main hall distant and faint. The breathing grew louder. Suddenly a hand shot through the bars and grabbed my wrist, ice cold, strong as iron. A face pressed up against the bars, pale, hollow-eyed, with skin stretched thin over bone. "They left me here," it rasped. "They forgot me." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The grip tightened. "Stay," the voice whispered. "You'll keep me company." The lantern flickered and died. In the pitch dark, I felt something yank me forward, pulling me halfway into the cell. My fingers dug into the stone floor as I struggled to hold on. Then, just as suddenly, the grip released. When my lantern sputtered back to life, the cell was empty, except for one thing: a fresh set of claw marks on the floor, leading out of the cell, and stopping right where I was kneeling. Panicking, I scrambled back through the passage, but when I reached the main hallway, The group was gone. The corridors twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the fortress. I began to hear footsteps following me, sometimes behind me, sometimes ahead, always just out of sight. Finally, I stumbled into a chamber I'd never seen before. In the center was an ancient wooden chair with iron restraints. On the walls hung tools of torture, their metal still glinting as if they had been cleaned. The chair creaked. I froze as I saw it move slightly, as if someone invisible had just sat down. And then, slowly, the restraints snapped shut one by one. Click, 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 though no one was there. A voice echoed around the chamber. "Now we're even." The next thing I remember is waking up outside the tower gates at dawn. My clothes were damp, my knees scraped, and my phone battery was completely drained. But there was a new photo in my gallery. It showed the torture chair, and me sitting in it, wide-eyed, screaming, though I never remembered anyone taking that picture. Story No. 4. It was raining the night I visited the Tower of London. The stones glistened in the lamplight as water trickled down the ancient walls. I was there for a special nighttime photography pass, something that let me roam certain areas after the tourists had gone. As soon as I entered, I heard them, the ravens. Their caws echoed through the courtyard. According to legend, if the ravens ever left the tower, the kingdom would fall. But tonight there seemed to be more of them than usual, perched on every wall, staring silently at me. I tried to focus on my photos, but a strange uneasiness crept in. Each time I looked up, the ravens had moved closer, silently hopping along the stones until they were just a few feet away. I made my way toward the White Tower. As I approached, one raven swooped down and landed right in front of me, blocking my path. It stared at me with one beady eye and let out a sound that didn't sound like a normal caw. It sounded almost like a word. Go. The sound froze me in place. I turned to leave, but the massive wooden door to the White Tower creaked open on its own. Inside was pitch dark. Against my better judgment, I stepped in. The air was different inside, colder, damp, and heavy with the smell of rusted iron. My flashlight barely worked, flickering as if the batteries were dying. Then I heard it, the faint sound of chains dragging on stone. I raised my camera and took a flash photo. The burst of light illuminated a shadowy figure at the end of the corridor, a man in rags, his face hidden under a hood. When the flash faded, he was gone. The dragging sound grew louder, closer. I backed up, but the door behind me slammed shut. Suddenly, I heard whispering. Multiple voices coming from every direction, speaking in Old English, prayers, confessions, cries for mercy. I stumbled into a chamber I didn't recognize. Iron cages lined the walls, some with bones still inside. The air was so cold my fingers went numb. And then, I wasn't alone. The hooded figure was back, standing in the center of the room. He slowly raised a shaking hand and pointed to the cages. They all thought they would leave, he rasped. One by one, the cages began to rattle. Skeletal hands reached through the bars, clawing at the air, trying to grab me. I ran, but the corridor twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the fortress. Every time I passed a window, a raven sat outside watching me. Finally, I found myself in the tower courtyard. For a moment, I thought I was safe until I realized it was silent. Completely silent. The ravens were gone. I looked down at my camera, hoping to find proof of what I'd seen. Every photo was blank except for the last one. It showed me standing in the courtyard, surrounded by ravens, hundreds of them, even though there had been none when I took the picture. In the corner of the image, just barely visible, was the hooded man, standing right behind me. When I looked up from the screen, I heard it again. A single raven perched on the gate, cawing softly. Only this time the sound was clear. Stay. And then the gate shut. Story No. 5. I had taken a night shift job as a security guard at the Tower of London. Most nights were uneventful. Just me, my flashlight, and the distant sound of tourists long gone. One night, as I made my rounds near the Wakefield Tower, I noticed something strange, a dark patch on the stone floor. At first I thought it was water from the rain, but when I shone my flashlight on it, the stain looked red. Blood red. Curious, I knelt down to look closer. The stone was cold and dry. Too dry for rainwater. Then I heard it. The faint sound of sobbing. It was coming from the next hallway. I followed the sound and found myself standing outside the infamous Bloody Tower, where the two young princes had vanished centuries ago. The sobbing grew louder, almost right behind the door. When I unlocked it and stepped inside, the temperature dropped instantly. My breath turned to mist. And there, on the dusty stone floor, were two small sets of footprints, wet as if someone had just walked through blood. They led deeper into the chamber. I followed, heart hammering. At the far end, I saw them, two boys dressed in old tattered royal clothes huddled in the corner. "Are you lost?" I whispered. They turned their heads slowly in perfect unison. Their faces were pale, their eyes dark and hollow. "They never found us," the younger one said, his voice echoing unnaturally in the empty room. The older one stood up, pointing to the floor. "It's still here." I looked down. The bloodstain I had seen earlier was now beneath my feet, but this time it was fresh, glistening. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me, heavy, deliberate. When I turned, a man was standing there, dressed in the garb of a medieval executioner, his axe glinting in the dim light. He raised the axe slowly and said in a low, growling voice, "Another one for the stones." The boy screamed and vanished. The next thing I knew, the lights flickered and went out completely. In the pitch dark, I felt warm liquid run past my shoes. When the lights came back, the bloodstain had spread across the entire floor, and in the center of it lay a shadow, the shape of a man, thrashing silently, as if being strangled by invisible hands. I ran for the door, but it slammed shut before I could reach it. The shadow slowly rose from the floor, taking human shape, tall, broad, faceless, and started walking toward me. "Join them," it hissed. I blacked out. When I woke up, I was lying outside the tower gates. Morning had come. The other guards found me shaking, my uniform stained with something they couldn't identify. They told me no one had been assigned to the Bloody Tower that night. It had been sealed for years. When I checked the CCTV footage later, the camera showed me entering the tower, but it never showed me coming out. Story No. 6. I had always been fascinated by the Tower of London. This time, instead of joining a day tour, I booked a rare overnight paranormal experience, a chance to stay inside the tower after dark. There were 5 of us, plus a guide named Thomas. At midnight, we were locked inside the fortress. The air felt heavy, like the walls themselves were watching us. We started in the Salt Tower, where prisoners had carved strange symbols into the stone centuries ago. As Thomas explained the carvings, one of the symbols started glowing faintly. Everyone froze. Then we heard it, a soft whisper, low and almost melodic, coming from the wall itself. At first, I thought it was a prank, but the whisper grew louder until we could make out words. "Let me out." The guide looked pale. "We should move on," he said quickly. But I stayed back for a moment, pressing my ear to the wall. The voice was clearer now, almost desperate. "They buried me here, beneath the stone. Find my bones." Suddenly, the stone under my hand turned ice cold, and I felt something move behind it, like fingers brushing the other side. The group had already moved toward the White Tower. I ran to catch up, but as soon as I stepped inside, the temperature dropped so sharply that I could see my breath. The White Tower felt wrong that night. Silent, suffocating. As we stood there, a heavy thud echoed above us, like boots walking on the wooden floor of the upper level, but no one was supposed to be up there. The guide reluctantly led us upstairs. At the top, we found a single chair rocking slowly, as if someone had just stood up from it. And then, we saw him. A man in 16th century clothing, a noose mark still visible on his neck, standing in the corner. He stared at us for a long moment, then smiled. The rocking chair stopped on its own. He lifted a finger to his lips, shushing us, and every torch in the room went out. The only light left came from the moon through a narrow window. and in that faint light we saw shapes, dozens of them, forming along the walls. Prisoners, soldiers, queens. Their mouths all moved at once, whispering in unison, "Stay." The door slammed shut. One by one, the others started screaming as invisible hands grabbed them, pulling them back toward the walls. I tried to fight, but cold hands wrapped around my throat, forcing me to my knees. Through the corner of my eye, I saw the hanged man step closer, kneeling in front of me. "You came to see ghosts," he whispered. "Now you are one." I woke up outside the tower gates at dawn, shaking. The others were gone. When I asked the staff about my group, they said no one else had been booked for that night. And when I went back to the salt tower in daylight, the glowing symbol was gone. But a new carving had appeared. It was my name.